The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of the embassy as Marcus Thompson adjusted his dress blue uniform one final time. His hands moved with practiced precision, ensuring every ribbon, every crease was perfect. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught him that attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death, even here in the peaceful halls of diplomacy. Marcus had volunteered for embassy duty after his last deployment, hoping for something quieter, something that would help him sleep through the night again. At 28, the Marine Corps had already given him enough memories to last several lifetimes. The screech of incoming mortars, the weight of carrying wounded brothers to safety, the silence that followed firefights, all of it followed him across the ocean to this assignment in London. Today was different, though. Today, the British royal family was visiting the American embassy for a rare joint ceremony honoring fallen soldiers from both nations. Marcus had been selected as the Honor Guard representative, a recognition of his service record and his ability to stand perfectly still for hours without so much as a twitch. Across the courtyard, another figure prepared for the same ceremony. Sergeant William Ashworth of the Queen's Guard had been standing at attention outside royal residences for 6 years. His tall frame was encased in the iconic red tunic and bearskin hat that tourists photographed thousands of times each day. But William carried more than just the weight of tradition on his shoulders. 3 months ago, his younger brother James had been killed in a training accident during his first week of military service. James had always looked up to William, had joined the army because he wanted to be just like his big brother, who protected the Queen. The guilt ate at William every day. He wondered if his stories of military pride and honor had pushed James toward a fate he wasn't ready for. William's commanding officer had recommended him for this ceremony, believing that representing his unit at such an important event might help him work through his grief. What the officer didn't know was that William blamed himself not just for James's death, but for every young soldier who had ever looked up to the romanticized image of the stoic guard. As the morning progressed, both men took their positions. Marcus stood at one end of the memorial garden, his rifle held in precise ceremonial position. William took his place at the opposite end, his own weapon similarly positioned. Between them stretched a pathway lined with wreaths and flowers, where diplomats and family members would walk during the ceremony. The first guests began arriving at 10 o'clock. Marcus watched from the corner of his eye as elderly veterans in wheelchairs were pushed along the pathway, their family members walking beside them with quiet reverence. Some stopped to read the names engraved on the memorial wall, running their fingers over letters that spelled out the names of sons, daughters, husbands, wives who would never come home. William noticed the same scenes, but his attention was drawn to a different detail. Every few minutes, his eyes would flick toward Marcus, studying the American Marine's posture, his breathing, the slight tension in his shoulders that suggested someone fighting to maintain control. William recognized something in the other man's stance because he felt it himself, the weight of loss, the struggle to appear strong when everything inside felt broken. An hour into the ceremony, a young boy no more than 8 years old broke away from his family group and wandered toward the memorial wall. His grandmother called after him, but the boy was fascinated by the eternal flame that burned in a bronze bowl at the center of the garden. He reached out his small hand toward the flame, not understanding the danger. Both guards saw the child at the same moment. Military training kicked in instantly. Marcus's muscles tensed, ready to break position to protect the boy. William felt the same impulse, his entire body coiled to spring into action. But their orders were clear. Maintain position no matter what happened during the ceremony. Breaking formation was not just against protocol. It could be seen as a security breach that might end their careers. The boy's hand moved closer to the flame. His grandmother was still several steps away, calling his name but unable to reach him in time. Other guests were beginning to notice the situation, but no one was close enough to help. Marcus and William locked eyes across the courtyard for the first time. In that brief moment of contact, each man saw his own internal struggle reflected in the other's gaze. The weight of duty versus the instinct to protect. The rules they had sworn to follow versus the human impulse to act. The boy's finger was inches from the flame now. His grandmother's voice grew more urgent. The moment stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Then something unexpected happened. The boy's older sister, perhaps 10 years old, appeared beside him and gently pulled his hand away from the flame. She whispered something in his ear and led him back to their family. Crisis averted, but the tension between the two guards remained. Marcus found he couldn't look away from William now. There was something in the British soldier's eyes that spoke to him, a recognition of shared experience that went beyond words or nationality. They were both men who had trained their entire adult lives to follow orders without question, but who carried the burden of decisions that haunted their quiet moments. As the ceremony continued, Marcus began to notice other details about William, the way the man's jaw clenched slightly when children walked past, the almost imperceptible shift in his breathing when elderly veterans saluted the memorial, the tight control that suggested someone fighting their own internal battle. William was making similar observations about Marcus. The American Marine's eyes held a distance that William recognized from his own mirror. When military families approached the memorial, Marcus's grip on his rifle would tighten just slightly, as if he was fighting the urge to reach out to them somehow. The formal speeches began at noon. Diplomats and military officials took turns speaking about sacrifice, honor, and the bonds between allied nations. Marcus listened to words about courage and duty, but his mind kept drifting to the faces of the men he hadn't been able to save. William heard phrases about noble service, but all he could think about was his brother's funeral, the flag folded and presented to their mother, the weight of guilt that no ceremony could lift. During the 21-gun salute that concluded the formal portion of the ceremony, both men executed their movements with flawless precision. But as the final echoes of the rifle volleys faded across the courtyard, something had changed between them. The brief eye contact had evolved into something more, a silent communication that neither fully understood, but both felt deeply. As guests began to disperse for the reception inside the embassy building, Marcus and William remained at their posts. They would stand guard for another 2 hours before being relieved. The courtyard grew quiet, except for the soft conversations of diplomatic staff and the occasional photographer capturing images of the memorial. It was then that the real duel began. Not a physical confrontation, but something far more complex and personal. Marcus found himself studying William's technique, the way the British Guard maintained his position despite what was clearly emotional turmoil beneath the surface. William was doing the same, observing how Marcus channeled his own internal struggles into the rigid discipline of his stance. Neither man understood why they felt compelled to engage in this silent competition. Perhaps it was a way of honoring the struggles they both carried. Perhaps it was a test of their own resolve. Or perhaps it was simply the need to connect with someone who might understand the weight they carried without requiring explanations or justifications. A light rain began to fall, adding another layer of challenge to their vigil. Water droplets collected on their uniforms, ran down their faces, but neither man moved to wipe them away. They stood like statues, each trying to outlast the other in a contest of will and endurance that no one else in the courtyard fully comprehended. The few remaining guests began to take notice. Conversations grew quieter as people became aware that something unusual was happening between the two guards. A photographer raised her camera, then lowered it again, sensing that this moment was too personal to capture without permission. An elderly veteran in a wheelchair positioned himself where he could observe both men. He had served in World War II and recognized the look in their eyes. He had worn the same expression himself many times, the face of a soldier carrying more than his equipment, bearing burdens that civilians could never fully understand. As the afternoon light began to shift, casting different shadows across the courtyard, Marcus and William continued their silent vigil. Each man was testing himself as much as the other, pushing against the limits of physical endurance and emotional control. The rain continued to fall, and still they stood motionless, locked in a contest that had no rules, no judges, and no declared winner. But something was building between them in the silence, a recognition of shared pain, shared dedication, shared humanity beneath the uniforms and protocols that defined their public faces. Neither man could have explained what was happening, but both felt the weight of it settling over the courtyard like a heavy blanket. The memorial garden had become the stage for something more than ceremony. It had become the setting for two warriors to face not just each other, but the demons they carried within themselves. And everyone who remained to witness it understood, even without words, that they were seeing something extraordinary unfold in the quiet space between duty and grief. The rain intensified as the afternoon wore on, but Marcus and William remained frozen in their positions, like ancient monuments weathering a storm. What had begun as routine ceremonial duty had transformed into something neither man could have anticipated. A silent battle of wills that was drawing attention from everyone who remained in the courtyard. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a military psychologist attending the ceremony as part of the diplomatic delegation, was the first to recognize what was actually happening. She had spent years working with soldiers suffering from post-traumatic stress, and she could read the signs written in their body language. This wasn't just military discipline on display. This was two men using their training to fight internal wars that had nothing to do with the ceremony around them. Marcus felt the water seeping through his dress uniform, but he refused to acknowledge the discomfort. His mind drifted to the last time he had stood this still for this long. It was during a 12-hour watch in a forward operating base outside Kandahar. He and his partner had waited motionless in a sniper's nest, watching for enemy movement that never came. His partner, Danny Rodriguez, had talked quietly through the night about his plans after deployment: college, marriage, a house with a white picket fence. Danny never made it home. An improvised explosive device took him 3 weeks before their rotation was scheduled to end. Marcus had been walking 5 feet behind him when it happened. 5 feet that might as well have been 5 miles for all the good it did Danny. Now, standing in this peaceful London courtyard, Marcus could still hear the echo of that explosion, still feel the helplessness of watching his best friend disappear in a cloud of smoke and debris. William's own memories were equally haunting but different in their pain. He thought about the last conversation he'd had with James, just 2 days before the training accident. James had called him, excited and nervous about starting basic training. He had asked William for advice, wanted to know what it was really like to serve. "Just remember why you're doing it," William had told him. "You're protecting something bigger than yourself. That's what gets you through the hard parts." Those words felt like poison now. James had died trying to live up to an ideal that William had painted for him, an image of military service that emphasized glory and honor without acknowledging the true costs. William wondered if his brother would still be alive if he had been honest about the nightmares, the survivor's guilt, the way military service could break a person's soul, even as it built their character. As the second hour of their impromptu contest began, other people started to gather around the edges of the courtyard. Word had spread quietly through the embassy that something extraordinary was happening outside. Staff members found reasons to walk past the windows. Security personnel positioned themselves where they could monitor the situation without interfering. Ambassador Harrison, a career diplomat who had served in 6 different countries, stepped outside to assess the situation personally. He had seen many military ceremonies over the years, but this felt different. The tension in the air was palpable, and the absolute stillness of both guards was almost supernatural in its intensity. "Should we intervene?" asked his aide, a young Foreign Service officer who was clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Ambassador Harrison watched the 2 men for a long moment before shaking his head. "Sometimes the most important battles are fought in silence," he said quietly. "These men are working through something that words can't touch. The best thing we can do is honor their process." Marcus was beginning to feel the physical strain of maintaining his position for so long. His legs ached, his back was stiffening, and the weight of his rifle seemed to increase with each passing minute. But every time he considered shifting his position, he would catch sight of William across the courtyard, still standing perfectly motionless despite the same challenges. There was something in the British Guard's absolute stillness that spoke to Marcus on a level deeper than competition. It was as if William was demonstrating that it was possible to bear unbearable weight without breaking, to carry impossible burdens without collapsing. Marcus found strength in that example, even as he recognized that William was probably drawing similar inspiration from his own endurance. William was indeed watching Marcus, studying the way the American Marine channeled his obvious internal struggle into unwavering external discipline. William had spent months feeling like he was falling apart inside while maintaining the facade of the perfect soldier. Seeing Marcus endure his own battle with such dignity gave William hope that maybe he wasn't as broken as he thought. The crowd watching them had grown larger, but remained respectfully silent. Among the observers was Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, an 80-year-old woman who had lost her husband in the Korean War and her son in Vietnam. She understood something about the weight these young men were carrying, and she felt compelled to witness their struggle. "My husband used to stand like that," she whispered to her daughter. "After he came back from Korea, he would sometimes just stand in our backyard for hours, perfectly still, like he was trying to hold something together through sheer willpower. I never understood it then, but I think I'm beginning to now." A news photographer who had been covering the ceremony noticed the growing crowd and approached with his camera. Dr. Mitchell quickly intercepted him. "I wouldn't," she said softly but firmly. "What you're witnessing is sacred. Some moments are too important to be reduced to images." The photographer lowered his camera and joined the quiet circle of observers instead. Even he could feel that something profound was happening, something that demanded respect rather than documentation. As the 3rd hour began, both men were reaching the limits of their physical endurance. Marcus's vision was starting to blur slightly from fatigue and dehydration. William's legs were trembling almost imperceptibly, though his upper body remained rock steady. But neither was willing to yield. This had become more than a test of physical stamina. It was a meditation on loss, a prayer formed from suffering, a way of honoring all the people they had failed to save by proving they could save themselves. The rain continued to fall steadily, and the late afternoon light began to take on the golden quality that photographers love. But there was nothing romantic about what was happening in the courtyard. This was raw human endurance, 2 souls refusing to break under the weight of their experiences. A young embassy intern, probably no older than James had been when he died, approached the memorial wall to lay a single white rose. As he walked between the 2 guards, both Marcus and William felt a simultaneous jolt of protective instinct. The boy reminded them both of the innocence they had lost, the futures that had been stolen, the promises that had been broken. For a moment, both men wavered. The emotional impact of seeing youth and hope walking between them threatened to break their concentration. But somehow, that shared moment of vulnerability made them stronger. They were not just enduring for themselves anymore, They were enduring for all the young soldiers who would never have the chance to grow old and wise and tired. Dr. Mitchell made notes on her phone, documenting the psychological dynamics she was observing. In her professional opinion, both men were using this extended period of physical discipline as a form of therapy, working through trauma that conventional treatment might take months to address. The silent communication between them was creating a space for healing that neither could have found alone. The embassy's head of security approached Ambassador Harrison again. "Sir, they've been at this for over 3 hours now. Should we have medical personnel standing by?" The ambassador considered the question carefully. Both guards looked exhausted but determined. Their breathing was controlled, their positions stable. More importantly, the intensity of their focus suggested that this was serving a purpose that went beyond mere stubbornness. "Have the medics available but out of sight," he decided, "and make sure no one interferes unless there's an actual medical emergency. Whatever is happening here, it's important to them both." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the memorial garden, the silent duel between Marcus and William continued. They had become the center of a growing crowd that watched in respectful silence, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Two warriors facing their demons in the only way they knew how, with absolute discipline and unwavering determination. Neither man could have explained why this contest had become so important to them. But both felt that something essential was at stake, something that couldn't be won or lost in the conventional sense, but could only be experienced and endured. The courtyard had become a sacred space where grief and duty and hope were being forged into something new, something that might help them both find a way forward from the darkness they carried. The memorial garden held its breath as two soldiers continued their silent vigil, each man teaching the other that it was possible to stand firm in the face of overwhelming sorrow, and that sometimes the greatest victories were the ones that no one else could see. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when something shifted in the atmosphere of the memorial garden. Marcus and William had been standing motionless for nearly 4 hours now, their silent duel having drawn a crowd of more than 50 people who watched in reverent silence. But the change that was coming wasn't visible in their postures or breathing. It was something deeper, something that both men felt simultaneously. Marcus's mind had moved beyond the physical discomfort, beyond the competition, beyond even the memories that had haunted him for so long. In the absolute stillness of the moment, he found himself thinking about Danny Rodriguez differently than he had in months. Instead of focusing on the moment of loss, he began to remember his friend's laughter, his dreams, his unshakable belief that they were making the world a better place one mission at a time. "You know what gets me through the rough days?" Danny had said during one of their long conversations in the desert. "Knowing that somewhere back home, kids are playing in playgrounds because of what we do out here. Parents are tucking their children into bed safely because we're willing to stand watch in places like this." For the first time since Danny's death, Marcus felt the truth of those words rather than the bitter irony. His friend hadn't died for nothing. The service they had given, the sacrifice that had been made, had meaning that went beyond the circumstances of any single moment. Standing here in this peaceful garden, protecting a ceremony that honored fallen soldiers from both their countries, Marcus felt connected to that larger purpose again. William was experiencing his own transformation. The guilt that had consumed him since James's death was still there, but it was no longer the only thing he could feel. Through the absolute discipline of maintaining his position, he had found a way back to the values that had drawn him to military service in the first place. He remembered the day he had first put on the uniform, the pride he had felt in serving something greater than himself. James hadn't joined the army because William had misled him about the risks. James had joined because he believed in the same principles that had motivated William, the desire to protect others, to serve his country, to be part of something honorable and meaningful. The tragedy of his death didn't diminish the nobility of that choice. As these realizations settled over both men, the crowd around them seemed to sense the change. Mrs. Hartwell, the elderly veteran's widow, stepped forward slightly. She had been watching for over an hour, and her experience with grief told her that something was shifting in the silent drama unfolding before them. Dr. Mitchell also recognized the signs. In her work with traumatized soldiers, she had learned to identify the moments when healing began to occur. The rigid tension that had defined both guards' postures for hours was gradually giving way to something that looked more like peace than endurance. A young girl, perhaps 7 years old, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mama, why are those soldiers standing so still for so long?" Her mother knelt beside her and spoke in a whisper that somehow carried across the silent courtyard. "Sometimes, sweetheart, people need to be very still and very quiet so they can hear what their hearts are trying to tell them. Those brave men are listening very carefully to something important." The child's innocent question seemed to break something loose in both Marcus and William. They were no longer just enduring this vigil for themselves. They were demonstrating to everyone watching that it was possible to face overwhelming pain with dignity, to transform suffering into strength through discipline and determination. Ambassador Harrison approached the edge of the crowd and spoke quietly to his aide. "Contact their commanding officers. Whatever schedule they had for the rest of the day needs to be cleared. This ends when they're ready for it to end, not a moment before." As the golden hour light bathed the memorial garden, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since before Danny's death. A genuine moment of peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of something larger that could contain the pain without being destroyed by it. He understood now that he didn't need to forget his friend or stop grieving for him. He just needed to remember that Danny's life had meant something, and that his own life could continue to mean something too. William was reaching a similar conclusion about his brother. James's death had been a tragedy, but James's life had been a gift. His younger brother had been brave and idealistic and committed to making the world better. Those qualities didn't become meaningless because his life had been cut short. If anything, they became more precious and more important to honor. The shift in both men's energy was subtle but unmistakable. Without moving from their positions or changing their external bearing in any visible way, they had somehow moved from rigid endurance to something that looked more like meditation. The crowd watching them seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, sensing that the crisis point had passed. Dr. Mitchell made a final note on her phone. Hour 4.5. Both subjects showing signs of psychological resolution. Recommend allowing natural conclusion. It was then that the unexpected happened. A small child, the same boy who had nearly touched the eternal flame hours earlier, broke away from his family again. But this time, instead of running toward danger, he walked directly to the space between Marcus and William. He stood there for a moment, looking back and forth between the two guards, then did something that no one could have predicted. He saluted. It wasn't a proper military salute. His small hand was positioned incorrectly. His posture was casual rather than rigid. But the gesture carried such genuine respect and admiration that it seemed to pierce through all the ceremony and protocol and speak directly to the hearts of both men. For the first time in over 4 hours, Marcus and William moved simultaneously. Without breaking their basic positions or abandoning their posts, they both returned the child's salute with perfect military precision. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like the culmination of everything they had been working toward. The boy smiled broadly and returned to his grandmother, who wiped tears from her eyes as she gathered him into her arms. The crowd around the courtyard began to disperse naturally, understanding instinctively that the most intense part of whatever had been happening was complete. But Marcus and William continued to stand. They remained at their posts as the sun continued to set, but something fundamental had changed. The desperate endurance had been replaced by chosen service. They were no longer standing because they couldn't allow themselves to fall. They were standing because they chose to honor the memory of those who couldn't stand anymore. As the official ceremony time came to an end and their relief guards approached, both men prepared to conclude their vigil. They had been scheduled for a 2-hour shift that had somehow become a 5-hour journey through grief, guilt, remembrance, and finally, a kind of peace. The relief guards approached with obvious respect for what they had witnessed. Sergeant Rodriguez, a different Rodriguez which struck Marcus as almost cosmic in its significance, approached Marcus first. "Sir, we're here to relieve you." Marcus nodded once, then executed the formal transfer of duty with the same precision he had maintained throughout the entire afternoon. As he stepped away from his position, he allowed himself to look directly at William for the second time since their vigil had begun. William was completing his own transfer of duty with equal formality. As he stepped away from his post, he met Marcus's gaze across the courtyard. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Two warriors who had shared something that could never be fully explained or replicated. Then, in a moment that surprised everyone, including themselves, they walked toward each other. They met in the center of the memorial garden, near the eternal flame that had started this entire journey when a small boy had nearly reached for it hours earlier. Without speaking, they extended their hands to each other. The handshake that followed was simple and brief, but it carried the weight of everything they had endured together. In that moment, they weren't an American Marine and a British Royal Guard. They were just two men who had found a way to transform their pain into something stronger. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly, his voice rough from hours of silence. "Thank you," William replied, understanding perfectly what they were thanking each other for. They walked away in different directions, returning to their respective duties and responsibilities. But both men carried something new with them. The knowledge that they could survive their worst memories, that their service had meaning beyond their mistakes, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought in absolute silence. Dr. Mitchell watched them go and smiled to herself. In her professional opinion, both men had just accomplished more healing in one afternoon than months of traditional therapy might have achieved. They had found a way to honor their losses without being destroyed by them, to carry their burdens without being crushed by the weight. The memorial garden returned to its normal, peaceful quiet as evening approached. The eternal flame continued to burn, and the names on the memorial wall remained as permanent reminders of sacrifice and service. But something had been added to that space. The memory of two soldiers who had shown that it was possible to face the deepest grief with unwavering dignity, and that healing could happen in the most unexpected ways. Years later, both Marcus and William would look back on that afternoon as the turning point in their recovery from trauma. They would remember it not as a competition or a test of endurance, but as a moment when they learned that they were strong enough to carry their pain and wise enough to transform it into something that could help others. The silent duel between a Marine and a Royal Guard had ended not with victory or defeat, but with understanding, respect, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can survive anything that life demands of you.